I would like to welcome everyone to the inaugural event of the Laurier Military History webinar series. For those who didn't hear me the first time, I'm sorry for those technical difficulties, but my name is Eric Story. I am the outreach manager at the Laurier Center for Military Strategic and Disarmament Studies, though we shorten that to Laurier Military Center because the other one is very long. But aside from my duties as outreach manager, I am also a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Wilfrid Laurier University. Now, before we get to tonight's event, I would like to acknowledge that the Laurier Military Center, as well as its partners for tonight's event, the Region of Waterloo Museums, are located on the Haldimand Tract, which extends 6 miles on either side of the Grand River and is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. This land is a part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, a treaty negotiated during the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701 between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, and represents the agreement to share, protect resources, and live in peace with one another. Now, I kind of want to give you all a lay of the land of what we usually see during a speaker series event. Now, most of you or many of you will not know that the speaker series event or speaker series events, what traditionally happens during the speaker series is that we have speakers come in during the academic calendar year to our physical location in Waterloo, Ontario. And we usually bring about 7 or 8 speakers every single year, and they'll give a talk to the local Kitchener-Waterloo community. So it's a very local event. And when you come in through the doors, what you'll see is an excellent spread of donuts from Zares, cookies, coffee from Tim Hortons, beverages. And people come in, they grab their treats, they sit down, and they hear an evening of military history. And then when they're done, they'll go up and they'll pick up some more treats and some more coffee and maybe talk to one of us or the speaker along the way out. And that's kind of how it usually goes. But obviously, we can't do that anymore. We aren't in an environment where we can have in-person talks. So we've pivoted to online. And I'm really excited that we've done so. And that's because during our speaker series events, like I said, usually people come from the Kitchener, Waterloo, Guelph regions. So it's very local. But tonight, we have people coming from literally across the world to hear our speaker tonight, which is fantastic. We have people coming from, of course, across Canada, but we also have some attendees from the States. We have several attendees from Great Britain. I'm not sure if they're staying up super late to watch this talk tonight. They might be interested in the recording that we will post much later. But in any case, tonight's events is being attended by people literally around the world from several different hemispheres across the world. And I find that really exciting and a pretty cool part of this kind of shift from in-person to a digital speaker series or a webinar series, as we have named it. Now, before I begin today, I would actually like to give a quick acknowledgement and a quick thanks to someone. And that someone is Mark Humphreys. Now, many of you will know Mark as Associate Professor at Wilfrid Laurier University, as well as the previous director of the Laurier Military Center. And that may surprise you when I say previous, because this summer, Mark has decided to step down from the directorship of the center and make room for new leadership. Now, throughout his tenure at the center since 2014, Mark spearheaded the largest digital archival project Wilfrid Laurier University has ever produced. It was called Through Veterans' Eyes, where over 200,000 pension files from the First World War in Canada were digitized. Once made available, I believe this collection, will become one of the most valuable and consulted archival sources in Canada. I really do believe that, and it's a testament to Mark that this project has come about. Now, Mark, he also saw the center's transition and to one that studied not only military history, but the history of war in society more broadly, which he saw as a more inclusive and productive way of approaching war and conflict in the past. From that vision, Mark was instrumental in establishing the Canadian Experience of War book series with the University of Toronto Press, which just a few years ago actually added its first entry by a previous employee of the Laurier Military Center and a graduate student of Wilfrid Laurier University. Now, under Mark's leadership, the center hired more undergraduate students each year than any other department across Laurier campus, and its programs, such as outreach, which the webinar series here tonight falls under, were run by and for students, which Mark ultimately believed was how university research centers should function. His unwavering support of students did not go unnoticed. Over the past 6 years, the center has faced many challenges and questions about its future. Mark has devoted hundreds of hours, literally hundreds of hours, ensuring his vision for the center would remain as a student-run facility for the study of war and society. Building on the solid foundation that Terry Kopp established almost 30 years ago, it's a testament to Mark's intellect, his stubborn diligence, or diligent stubbornness, and I'm sure many of you can attest to those two ways of describing Mark if you know him. And of course, also his dedication to his work and students, that the center has achieved an even greater place of prominence on Laurier campus and across the History Academy than when he first assumed the directorship. And on behalf of all of the staff at the Laurier Military Center, both past and present, and the students who have had the privilege of working under him over the past 6 years, I would like to thank Mark very much for everything he has done. We will miss his wild predictions about US and Canadian politics at the lunch table, but wish him all the best in his future endeavors. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering, if Mark has stepped down, then who has taken over the center? Who is the new director? And I thought tonight actually would be an excellent opportunity for us to introduce the new director of the center. His name is Dr. Kevin Spooner. He's Associate Professor of History and North American Studies, and now the new director of the Laurier Center for Military Strategic and Disarmament Studies. So I will briefly turn it over to him to introduce himself and provide you with just a little bit more information about the center and also about the webinar series. So I will turn it over to Kevin. Sorry, Kevin, I'm not going to be able to do it for you. You're going to have to unmute and start your video. There we go.
Thanks, Eric. That was a wonderful, great tribute to Mark. I've got some incredibly big shoes that I'll never be able to fill. I just want to say tonight, I'll keep my remarks actually quite brief. On behalf of the center, I want to welcome everyone to this year's first event in our webinar series, which, as Eric's pointed out, we've had to do and develop in lieu of our live lecture series. And of course, the downside is we missed the Zares Donuts, but the positive side is, as Eric's pointed out, we were able to reach so many people, and that's a marvelous indication of, I think, the level of interest in all things military, and of course our speaker tonight. And on that note, I'd just really like to say that it's wonderful to begin with the series this year, the webinar series with Tim Cook. Tim is such a noted Canadian historian, such a great friend of the center, that I couldn't be happier that the webinar series is starting with a talk by Tim on his latest research. These webinars, in my view, are really a great example of what the center does ever so well, and that's connecting scholars and communities. The center really is fundamentally about community engagement. It's one of the things that we do very, very well. And our students, as Eric is a fine example of, help us to do this, right? They're the ones who figure out how it is that we're going to transform something that's a normal lecture series into something that's now done via Zoom, that's done online, and in a way that really amps up our ability to connect with people. And so I want to thank Eric for all of his effort in coordinating this evening and making it come together. I'm going to leave it there. I hope everybody enjoys tonight. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Kevin. I really appreciate those very kind remarks. And I must say that this has truly been a group effort, a team effort to get this webinar series off the ground. I'd like to thank Matt Baker. He's in the background, kind of working some of the technical stuff. I'd like to thank Kyle Falcon for kind of agreeing to do all these practice sessions kind of off the cuff without me planning ahead. And everyone else, Kyle Pritchard, Brittany Dunn, and everyone else. I'm sure I'm missing a few, but it's truly been a team effort. So thanks to everyone for helping pull this together and making tonight happen. Now, before I turn it over to our speaker tonight, since we're kind of in a digital environment, I would like you to know exactly what those functionalities that are sitting in front of you can do. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, at the bottom of the Zoom window, you should see 3 buttons. First one is chat, the second one is raise hand, and the third is Q&A. And some of you have already made use of the Q&A function when we had those technical difficulties to start. And again, I apologize for that. But if you have any questions for our speaker tonight, I would like you to enter them in the Q&A section, if you could. And you can do so at any point during the talk. If a question comes to mind, put it right into the Q&A, and those will be saved for the end of the talk. So after our speaker has finished his presentation, we will have a brief Q&A period, and I will draw from the collection of questions that have come up throughout the talk and then afterwards, and repeat them for Tim to answer to you all. The chat function has been disabled, so you will not be able to use that. Only I will be able to put anything into the chat function. So really the only thing that you have is the raise hand and the Q&A functionalities. And the raise hand is just basically to acknowledge if I ask you a question, and I can see that you all acknowledge that. So I have already taken up more than enough of your time tonight, as you are all here to see our speaker, not to hear me drone on. Our speaker, of course, needs no introduction. Tim Cook is an historian at the Canadian War Museum. His 11 books have won many awards, including the J.W. Defoe Prize for At the Sharp End in 2008 and for Vimy, The Battle and the Legend, published in 2018. Shock Troops won the 2009 Charles Taylor Prize for Literary Nonfiction, and in 2013 he received the Pierre Berton Award for popularizing Canadian history. He is also the 2-time winner of the C.P. Stacy Prize for the most distinguished book in Canadian military history and a 3-time winner of the Ottawa Book Award. For his contributions to Canadian history, he has been named a member of the Royal Society of Canada and the Order of Canada. And he is actually coming to you today from Ottawa, and I will ask him now to turn on his video and his audio so that you can see Tim Cook. Hey, Tim.
Hi, Eric. Thanks, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I first spoke at Laurier in 1996. It was my first academic paper. And I was nervous at the time. I've given a few papers since then. But one of the things I really love about the academic process and giving papers is to be with the audience and to hear their questions and the feedback. I think I'm known for kind of standing and talking wildly and sometimes spittle coming out of the mouth. And so that's probably a good thing in this environment. But I do wish I was there with you, but I'm really thrilled that you are here with us. This is my first time talking about this book, The Fight for History, which dropped yesterday. It was a book that was many years in the making, and I'm going to talk about it tonight. Before I do that, I just want to, because it's a book launch, and I won't take too much time, I want to get into the book. I just want to make a couple of notes. One, that I think as many of you know, I'm very proud to be an employee of the Canadian War Museum, and our museum opened last week. And I think that's a good sign for our community, a community of Canada's history. It's a good sign for museums. It's a good sign for our society. And so the next time you're in Ottawa, I hope that you will have a chance to visit and to explore. And I am the curator of an exhibition that will open in November called Forever Change, and it explores the impact of the Second World War on Canada and on Canadians. Secondly, my daughters are watching, and it's always a great thrill to do a shout out to them, to Chloe, to Emma and Paige. They are wonderful. And I hope that they will have a chance to read this book and have a greater sense of their country, of our shared history, and also of their grandfather who flew in Bomber Command. So I do have a PowerPoint. Now, 25 years ago, I didn't have a PowerPoint, but this is important, and I want you to see some of these images. And Eric, is that coming across?
Yes, it is.
Okay, that's great.
Tim, before you get going, I just want to say one quick thing to everyone, and I'll repeat this again before at the end of the talk. As Tim mentioned, he is launching his book with us tonight, The Fight for History, and it's been great that the Penguin Random House Canada has agreed to provide a discount code of 20% for Tim's book, The Fight for History. So for those who are interested in purchasing a copy, I will make sure to include all of this information in the chat, and you will be able to view this. And I'll make sure to echo this at the end as well. But for those who want to get ahead of the game, you can visit the Penguin Shop at penguinshop.ca, search for The Fight for History, add it to your cart, and once you have done so, enter Tim Cook 20, all one word, all caps, at checkout in the discount field for 20% off of your purchase. And again, I'll make sure to share that link in the chat so you'll be able to do that without having to remember everything I'll tell you. So sorry for the interruption, Tim. I'll turn it back over to you again.
All right, Eric, thanks for that. And well, let me tell you about the book. Titles matter, and if you know something about my books, I put a lot of time and effort into the titles, and this one went through a number of iterations, but in the end I settled on this idea of the fight for history, and of course the subtitle matters as well. I'll come back to that. But I see very much history around us as a fight, as a contested space, and certainly that has been the case with Canada's Second World War. It's often been a struggle between different groups over the interpretation of the past. And it's also been a fight against forgetting, a fight against forgetting. And that is important, I think. Now, I have written 13 books, of which this is my 13th. And I did a 2-volume history. As many of you know, this is the 3rd volume. The first one, The Necessary War in 2014, and Fight to the Finish in 2015. And I had thought initially that this was only going to be a 1-volume history. When I was writing those books, I had to go back to my publisher and say, it's too important. The history is too crucial, and that we were able to work on an arrangement where I did a 2-volume history. And they're very large books, as you know. Of course, I vowed never to write back-to-back histories again, but I did that here. But I didn't anticipate this 3rd volume. And yet, as I was touring the country and talking to Canadians about those 2 books, one of the things that came across in my discussions with Canadians was they said to me, we know the history of the Second World War, but I don't know the history of Canada's involvement. And that surprised me. I know I'm not a normal person. I've spent 25 years studying Canadian military history. I've talked to veterans my whole life. I have spent countless hours in the archives. I have interviewed veterans and their children and descendants. I've worked at the Canadian War Museum. And yet that struck me. That struck me that we didn't know our history as well as I thought we did. And of course, my books, and one of the things that I have tried to do for most of my writing career is to reach a wider audience. I have a PhD in history. I write academic articles. And yet I believe it's important to share our history with all Canadians, not just those in universities or those in the the ivory tower, but all Canadians. And this has been shaped by many experiences. I used to play hockey, and I'd be in the dressing room, and people would say, "Hey, we saw you on TV last night." And it was, you know, a reproduction of the History television show from 8 years ago. And I looked good because I was 25 years old. But that's how many people get their history, through television, through film, through museums. And certainly my work at the Canadian War Museum has reinforced this notion, where we get about 500,000 visitors a year. It has a tremendous impact on what Canadians know. And I began to think about the memory of the Second World War. And one of the aspects of this was my book in 2017, Vimy, the Battle and the Legend. And that was a book that tried to explore the memory of Vimy over time and why it was such an important touchstone in our social memory. The memorial on the ridge, of course, is absolutely crucial there to draw Canadians back. But Vimy has remained an important symbol and legend for many Canadians. It's on our $20 bill, it's in our passport. You'll remember in 2017, 25,000 Canadians returned to the Ridge, and I was very lucky to be there with CBC. But as I was there, I wondered why we didn't have a similar touchstone for the Second World War. Now, the Second World War, as many of you know, was an even more significant contribution by Canada. 1.1 million Canadians served in uniform. About 3 million, we think, worked in wartime industry. Almost every Canadian was affected. We fought around the world, on the oceans, in the air, in multiple land campaigns, our incredible home front production, the British Commonwealth Air Training Program, where we trained up 131,000 airmen. The list goes on. And yet, many Canadians I talked to didn't have a real clear understanding of what we had done during the war, our tremendous service and sacrifice. And that compelled me to lean into this book and to explore it. And that's where we are now. This is a book that explores 75 years of the constructed memory around the war. And it's a book that starts really with the end of the war, to explore the ways that Canadians talked about the war, the ways that they created memory and meaning, and ultimately how we very quickly left the war behind. So I think that maybe gives you just a bit of a sense of where I'm going here, but I will talk in a little more detail. I'll just go back to Trent because Kevin, who you just heard from, Kevin and I both went to Trent. Our time overlapped there. And in fact, we lived across the hall from each other. I was a first year, he was a fourth year. I may have been a little wild at the time, but we both shared and had a great passion for history that I think was stirred at Trent. And when I was writing this book, I went back to my Trent undergraduate notes and I looked at what had been taught to me in the Second World War. And I don't think it was unique. I was at Trent from 1990 to 94. So around 1992, 93, I took my first Canadian history class there. And I looked at the notes, and for the most part, it was on Mackenzie King at the start of the war. It was on the failed operation at DiePPE. It was there was an exploration of the forced relocation of Japanese Canadians, and that was about it. I mean, it was a survey class. It was one class. And yet, for the most part, as it was taught to me, the war was largely about Mackenzie King and the politics of the war, which included conscription, the Japanese-Canadian relocation, and DiePPE. Now, there is so much more. And I don't think I fell asleep in that class because there were a few more notes, but I think that was the way that the Second World War was taught in the 1990s. It was a story of defeat. It was a story of disgrace. That's wrong. Our massive contributions during the war were staggering. As I said, 1.1 million Canadians in uniform, almost an entire society geared to victory. It was a war where 100,000 Canadians served in the Navy, 12,000 in the Merchant Navy, the absolutely crucial contributions of Canada during the Battle of the Atlantic, defending the East Coast, defending the West Coast, repelling the U-boats in the Battle of the St. Lawrence, fighting in Hong Kong, fighting in DiePPE, fighting in Sicily in the summer of 1943, 100,000 Canadians serving in the Italian campaign, all three services coming together on D-Day, the landing at Juno Beach, the defense of the beachhead, the fighting through Normandy, the clearing of the Channel ports in September of 1944, the absolutely crucial campaign in the Battle of the Scheldt in October and November, the defeat of the Germans in the Rhineland, the liberation of the Dutch. And that just touches on some of the contributions, far more than defeat and disgrace. So how did we get there? That's what I wanted to know. And I wondered if perhaps it was the cost of this war, 45,000 Canadians who were killed, 55,000 wounded. But I don't think that's what contributed to the silencing of our story. I think, in fact, this was a self-inflicted wound. We failed to tell our story. And I want to explore that a little bit, and that's really what the book focuses on. A key element to this, I think, is the return of our veterans. As I mentioned, about 1.1 million who served, 45,000 killed. So more than 1 million veterans coming back to Canada in 1945 and 1946. Many were already here, I guess, to being demobilized. And we treated the veterans fairly well. The Veterans Charter was among the most forward-thinking of series of legislations in Canadian history and certainly around the world. It helped to reintegrate our veterans back into society. We sent 50,000 to university. There were loans to buy houses and to start businesses. And we see coming out of this terrible war, this terrible but utterly necessary war, a Canada that is moving forward into a more prosperous period. We see the baby boom. We see a Canada with a new social security net. We see a Canada that is more sure of itself as a North American nation. And that's important because we cared for our veterans and they began to build up our country. And yet what we did not do, for the most part, was to write about the war and to present it in film beyond 1945. We didn't do a good job in telling our story, and I explore this in one of the first chapters. I look at the writing of the war. There were some instant histories that came out that were quite good and were national bestsellers, and yet for the most part, our war leaders did not write about the book. Of course, we know Churchill, the most important person in the 20th century, in my opinion, and certainly the greatest historian of the 20th century, wrote about the war and presented his war. And there are fascinating history books on that. But our leader, Mackenzie King, did not. Those of you who know, he kept his incredible diaries, which may be the most important series of personal records created in the 20th century. And yet he did not codify his views of the war effort and what Canada had done. We were overshadowed on that political front. And perhaps it was only natural that Mackenzie King would be overshadowed by Churchill, certainly, and by FDR, without a doubt. And even after FDR's death, I think his legacy overshadowed that of Mackenzie King. But it extended to the generals as well. And you can see on your screen there, Harry Crear, our general who commanded 1st Canadian Army at the end of the war, he didn't write his memoirs. Now, this was during a period where all of the generals were writing. Eisenhower, Bradley, Montgomery. These were international best-selling histories. People wanted to know what the generals had done during the war on the victorious side. And afterwards, when the German leaders, those who survived, those who were released from prison, they began to write their history. And yet, Canada's military leaders did not. And I write about this in the book. It's a fascinating story. I've been interested in the writing of history and how that contributes to our knowledge. Going back to my second book, Cleo's Warriors, which some of you may know, which is on the writing of Canadian military history. Now, Crear, people implored Crear to write the story because they said it would help to raise the Canadian profile. There was one writer, in fact, who offered to Crear that he would write the history. And he wrote this, I found in his archives. All the American generals are doing it, he said. And he said, if you did not, Canada would be left out of the story. And I would argue that was an important part of the silencing of the Canadian story. But it goes beyond our senior leaders. It includes the service personnel, our soldiers, our airmen, our sailors, 50,000 women who served in uniform. For the most part, they did not write about the war in the years afterwards. As I said, you can see Ross Monroe there on the screen, a wartime journalist. He wrote a number of key histories, but for the most part, those who served did not write about the war. I think we have a greater sense today of post-traumatic stress disorder and the way that war imprints itself on individuals and the challenges that veterans often face in finding the words to present their experiences. And yet the absence of almost the entire canon is shocking. There were a few veterans who wrote, but they were not received in any sort of way. And I've been able to talk to veterans and ask them about this. And one of them, Pilot Officer Ron Laidlaw, he said this. It's a quote here, and it's in the book. "For years, I've been trying to face up to this, but my mind is like a jigsaw puzzle, with many of the pieces either fuzzy or they won't fit into place or are lost." The challenges in taking the enormity of the war experience, both the heroics and the horror, the courage and bravery, and the other elements, the darker elements that we know are there from our study of service personnel, made it really difficult for these veterans to talk about their experiences. And I will come back to that, because that begins to change. And it begins to change when we as Canadians began to ask our veterans to create a space to help them talk about their experiences. But that would not be until very late in the 20th century. Now, the one exception to this is Charles Stacy, Colonel Stacy, who wrote the 3-volume Army Official History. It is widely acknowledged as one of the finest official histories of the war. And yet, as Stacy himself recounted in his many articles, in his unpublished diary, in his memoirs, he too struggled against a government that did not want to tell the story of Canada's war effort. Why? They were afraid of it. They were afraid of the controversies. They were afraid of what the history would reveal. And even as every other country in the world was writing official histories, we canceled ours. And if you want to know more, I write about that in Cleo's Warriors, but I also write about it from a different perspective in this new book, The Fight for History. All of this then was leading very quickly, within only a few years, to leaving the war behind us. I wondered again, as I said, was it about the death and destruction? And I don't think it was, because every other country was writing histories, and their generals and politicians and service personnel were writing. There was something about Canada. And I began to dig more, and I've explored this and presented it in more detail. I think one of the reasons partially is the impact of the Great War in Canada. The Great War is a defining moment in our history. Many historians have called it a coming-of-age event. People often describe Vimy as the birth of the nation. I've written about that. That is going too far, but I think that key phrase, the birth of the nation, speaks to how the war transformed us, traumatized us. 630,000 Canadians who served, 66,000 killed, new commanders like Sir Arthur Currie. The way that we emerged from that war, stepping out onto the world stage, using the contributions of the Canadian Corps and the Home Front as a way to move forward. And the way we also built memorials after that war. In every community across this country, wherever you are, I suspect, there is a memorial to the Great War, most built in the 20s and 30s, some a little bit later. From that war, of course, emerged the poppy as a symbol, what we now call the Royal Canadian Legion. Remembrance Day, of course, Armistice Day, renamed as Remembrance Day in 1931. All of these came together to create the history and the ongoing impact, I think, of the Great War. Also important when we think about the Second World War is that World War I, as the Americans call it, does not resonate, and certainly did not resonate in that country up until very recently. And so Canada didn't have to fight the Americans off in the mobilization of memory, even the commercialization of memory, which is something that we will see with the Second World War. And so what happened in 1945? Well, we didn't write the history books. We welcomed the veterans back, and they began to move forward into the prosperous 20th century. And we didn't build the same memorials. There was a fascinating debate in Canada on what to do to mark the service and sacrifice of Canadians. And I recount this in the book. And for the most part, Canadians did not want thousands of new stone memorials. They wanted living memorials. They wanted utilitarian memorials. They wanted parks and playgrounds and skating rinks and libraries. And we built those, and we called them often the Memorial Library or Memorial Arena. But there was a fierce debate in Canada on what to do. And some of the images here you can see, instead of building separate Second World War memorials, we often grafted the names of the Second World War onto those Great War memorials. Again, the Great War overshadowing in the realm of commemoration what we had done in the Second World War. Now, through my research in the archives, through oral histories, through study of magazines and newspapers of the time, I came across fascinating debates in 1945 and 1946, which have not been discussed in the literature, which have not been discussed, and which I think helped us to understand why we left behind the war so quickly and how it was silenced. There was a fascinating debate, for instance, about changing Remembrance Day. Remembrance Day is, of course, November 11th. And yet the Second World War veterans came back and said, what about the 6th of June, D-Day? What about the 8th of May? What about the 15th of August? There was a significant debate in Canada about perhaps changing Remembrance Day and changing it as a functional day of commemoration and reflection. In the end, the Second World War veterans accepted the fact that the Great War symbols were there and those rituals were there and they were to be built upon. But the one thing that they demanded was a new national memorial. And I write about this in the book. I've uncovered fascinating material in the National Archives and in private holdings about how the veterans said, we accept the poppy, we accept Remembrance Day, we accept many other elements of commemoration, remembrance, but we want a new memorial. And I recount this story, the Mackenzie King government, Mackenzie King himself, who had played really a key role in the unveiling of the memorial in May of 1939, and you can see an image of that here. He didn't understand what the Second World War veterans, he didn't understand why they wanted a memorial. And that many of them spoke to the figures on our national memorial. They're all Great War figures passing through the arch, 22 of them ultimately. And he argued that that should be fine. The Second World War veterans wanted something separate because they understood that a separate memorial would help to distinguish the memory of that necessary war. And there's a fascinating debate. In the end, the King government refused to build the memorial. As you know, we do not have one. And the National Memorial became instead the beautification of Ottawa. Now that's a bit shocking to me. I've lived in Ottawa 46 of my 48 years. Ottawa was to be the national memorial for the Second World War. Now, veterans were not happy about that, and they went after the government, and there was a very antagonistic relationship between the Legion, which was the spearhead of this movement, and the government. And one of the things I argue in the book, that the creation of the utilitarian memorials, while important and good, and there were arguments for that, and I talk about them in the book, they did not ultimately become sacred places. They were not places to bear witness. They were not places where the Second World War could be distinguished from the Great War. And so a number of factors come into play here, I think. One of the really crucial ones is the prosperity of our country. Moving forward, I talked to many veterans and their children, and of course they said, well, my dad wasn't thinking he was a veteran, he was 23 years old. or my great uncle was 25. They weren't interested in seeing themselves as veterans. They wanted to build their families and get jobs. And we created those conditions for that. And so, ironically, I think the prosperity of those post-war years also affected the way that we reflected upon the incredible contributions of Canada. Now, I continue in the book and I look at the 50s and 60s. And another contributing factor, I think, is the Cold War. And the Cold War, of course, where Canada picked its side and never neutral, always with our Western allies, plays out in many ways to diminish the memory of the Second World War. And one of the things I focus on in the book is a sensational story of Kurt Meyer and the 12th SS. And some of you may know this story, that these were the nemesis of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division in the days after D-Day, and again in August of 1944, fierce battles. And the 12th SS, Hitler Youth, had a reputation for killing prisoners on the battlefield. And we have established that 156 Canadians were executed after capture in the first week of battle in June of 1944. And a story of tremendous atrocity, and something I come back to in the book as the sites of memory here. But for the purposes of this talk and right now, the Kurt Meyer case is absolutely crucial to understand, I think, the shifting nature of the memory and the embracing of West Germany back into NATO in the early 1950s. And that really has an impact on how we reflect on the war. And I use Kurt Meyer as an example to look at how we turned our back on those executed Canadians. And if you want to find out more, well, as Eric has said, there's a very good code you should use to get your 20% off book. The story continues into the 1960s as well. That was a decade of turmoil, a decade of youth culture. It was a decade increasingly, at least by the midpoint, that becomes much more significantly activist and anti-war. And I write about that impact in the book. Now, what's fascinating here is that the Royal Canadian Legion understood this. They understood that the resonance of the Second World War was seeping away. There are agonizing stories and editorials in the Legion magazine and in other veterans publications where they talk about how the war is being forgotten, how new generations are not being taught it in our classrooms, and how their comrades who fell in defense of the liberal ideas that motivated them, many of them, to serve, was being left behind. And when we did think of war, and you can see that in the image here, we often thought of Canada as a nation of peacekeepers. And I'm very proud of our peacekeeping history. I'm proud of the way Canada has contributed to the world stage. And yet we are not just a nation of peacekeepers. We know that. We fought 6 wars in the 20th century: the South African War, the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War. We can think of the Cold War. You can think of Gulf War 1990 to 1991. Think of the Kosovo bombing campaign. Think of the Afghanistan mission and war in the 21st century. Think of the wars that shaped our country in the 19th and the 18th century. War has always been a part of our history. It has had a profound transformative effect on our history. And yet, in the case of the Second World War, in the 1960s and 70s, we're in a profound period of forgetting, of negligence, of casting away what our Canadian men and women did during the war. And I have a section in the book where I explore Remembrance Day, where there in 1968, the Globe and Mail described it as no longer a day of relevance, but one of public indifference. Public indifference. Now, during this period, another story that I uncovered was a second attempt by the Legion to create a new national monument, and it spans from about 1955 to 1967. The Legion, in fact, in 1957, the Diefenbaker government agreed to build a national monument in downtown Ottawa for the Second World War veterans. It was called the Shrine of Remembrance, or the National Remembrance Shrine. It went by a number of names. They went so far as to design it. There are plans for this, and it was to be unveiled in 1963. It was derailed through a number of reasons, which I recount, having been through the archival records, fascinating stories. But one of them, not only was the changeover of the Pearson, the Diefenbaker government to Pearson, but it was also a pushback across Canadian society. And I found this fascinating. It was a widespread debate where Canadians publicly said, we do not want a Second World War memorial. Chatelaine magazine called it unimaginative and wasteful. Maclean's and the Ottawa Journal derided the idea. The Globe and Mail wrote this: we are surely beyond the stage in which we thought it appropriate to honor our dead by erecting elaborate structures which have no practical use. Now that would have been a period, if we had built the memorial, I argue, where we would have had a stronger Second World War presence in this country. And I recount the sad story of the demise of that project, which I hope you will find of interest in the book. The trend continued, and a significant portion of the book is the way that we failed to tell our stories. Now, in Canada, it's never easy to make films, and I'm not naive, and I don't think that we will produce a Spielberg anytime soon, or a Tom Hanks who can rally $200 million for a major production, but we didn't try very damn hard. And in fact, often our stories were completely neglected in other major films. And I talk about the impact of film. Even to this day, of course, Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers has a tremendous impact. And in my circles, and I'm sure in yours, there's often a discussion of, why can't Canada do this? Why don't we even try? Where is the CBC? Where is the NFB? In some of the major productions, I talk about The Longest Day, which was the largest budgeted black and white film up to that point in history in 1962. It's an epic story. I imagine most of you have seen it. I talk about at the various showings of this film how veterans came out, Canadian veterans, Canadians who had landed on Juno Beach, Canadians who wanted to see their story represented. And as we know, the Canadian story is almost entirely absent from The Longest Day. It's a terrific film. I've seen it many times, and yet that is not the place to find our history. The Great Escape, another terrific film, takes perhaps this point to absurdity, where not only is it a Canadian story where Canadians were involved in the Great Escape, and Wally Flood, who was involved in building one of the major tunnels underneath the camp, act as an advisor on the film, but the Canadian story is completely pulled out, and our story is replaced by Americans. That made me mad. There was a lot in this book that made me mad, and I will come back to that. But one of the things I think is important to say is it's not Hollywood's job to tell the Canadian story. We should not be naive here. Nor is it Hollywood's job really to get the history right. I think they try more now, but there are great liberties with anyone who has seen any war film. Nonetheless, where is our story? Now, there is one important production that was put together and broadcast to Canadians in 1962. It was Canada at War, and maybe some of you have seen it, but 1962 was an awful long time ago. It was a 13-part series, and after years of research and gathering film footage, it was finally shown to Canadians. And this is one of the only post-1945 significant film productions for Canadians. And the reviews at the time were quite positive, and I write about this, and it's generally a good film. You can watch it still to this day and learn an important stories about our past. And yet the CBC, when it first showed this film, it showed it at 10:30 at night. And there was quite a lot of pushback by journalists who said, no, this is important history. Our young people need to know this. And yet it was cast off into the dead period when very few people were watching. as a greater insult, CBS, the American station, put on a D-Day story, and it was shown in Canada at prime time, and it barely mentioned the Canadians, and it was about D-Day. And again, this is a self-inflicted wound. We failed to tell our stories, and I wanted to come to grips with that. Where we did talk about the war was our fascination with DiePPE, and I explored DiePPE in quite a lot of detail. I think if Vimy is a touchstone for the Great War, DiePPE is our story. And isn't that strange? A significant defeat, there's no other way to describe DiePPE, and one day of the war. Why have we focused on the one day, the 19th of August, 1942? I tried to look at this, and I offer some thoughts, and DiePPE has fascinated all of us, and we continually come back to it. I think it is a battle that haunts us for a number of reasons. One is the conspiratorial element. Records, as many of you know, the raid was put on, it was canceled and then relaunched, and records were either not kept or destroyed. And many historians have tried to explore this with not enough information, I think, to understand one way or the other. But there have been all kinds of conspiracy stories, and conspiracies do draw people back to them. There's also an anti-British element to the DiePPE story, where we often talk about the British having done us in. I believe that's true. Mountbatten and his crew were way in over their heads in planning this operation, and yet the Canadians could have pulled out. Canadian commanders like Criar could have put an end to the operation. They didn't, and so there is blame to go around. And there is, of course, the battle itself in all of its slaughter, all of the power to move us to this day. I have stood on the beaches at DiePPE. I've stood on those rocks. You feel the weight of history there. There's more to it as well. But for whatever reason, we've been drawn to DiePPE. Now, it's not wrong to talk about our battles and our defeats. Again, I'm not suggesting we need to present heroic history and only the good stuff. And yet, that day diminished the 6 years of contribution during the Battle of the Atlantic. I was just speaking to a journalist today in Britain who says he knew something about Canada's contribution. He says, I always have to tell people that Canada played a key role in keeping Britain in the war. So true, but we don't even tell that story, do we? Think of the Scheldt, completely overshadowed by so many other events. And of course, this has only been confirmed with the Valor and the Horror. But before I get to that, there's a fascinating story that I talk about in the book. In 1983, a writer in Canadian Forum, in talking about the perverse, he said, Canadian focus on Hong Kong and DiePPE, he said, portraying ourselves continuously as losers makes shaping our own destiny as a nation more difficult. Why did we focus on defeat? And that was brought home never more so than during the 3 two-hour films for the Valor and the Horror, which were presented to Canadians in 1992. They were good, slick-looking films. The history was potted, and historians have pointed out the multiple errors of interpretation and fact. And yet, for the purposes of tonight's talk, what I found shocking was that they focused again on defeat. The defeat at Hong Kong, the defeat at Verrier Ridge, and Bomber Command, which was not a defeat, but which the filmmakers portrayed as an immoral act. And I won't go into the Valor and the Horror. You can again read about it in the book, except to say that this was following the trend up to the early 90s that our war had been reduced to disgrace and defeat. And the book also talks about the important Japanese-Canadian redress campaign, which was an important act, I think, of healing for that community, and yet brought forward again in an outsized role the fact that our country, the fact that nobody knew about our contributions. And so what did they know was DiePPE and the forced relocation of Japanese Canadians and conscription in French Canada. Where was the Scheldt? Where was the BCATP program? Where was the defense of North America? Where were the incredible service and sacrifice of Canadians in uniform and on the home front? It was not there. It was not taught. That was the low point, the valor and the horror. And the subtitle of the book is about forgetting and then also remaking. And from that low point of the early 1990s, I argue that we began to turn back to our history. And we did it at the 50th anniversary. Some of you will remember that. Thousands of Canadian veterans went back to France and especially to the Netherlands in 1995. And they were greeted as the liberators that they were, these aged veterans who had brought freedom with their blood and with their sacrifice. That was a major event. The two national networks broadcasted in English and French. Canadians woke up to find that we had thousands of veterans who had been living with us and who we had never paid much attention to. And I see that as a really crucial event. And I have talked to veterans and I quote from veterans who say, we were heroes here. And yet we returned to a country that barely knew we existed. And my argument is that from that point forward, after decades of indifference, Canadians woke up. They woke up and they began to see the veterans among them. We began to create a space to listen to their stories. That is part of this upward swing in the remaking of the history. And I continue on how veterans have contributed to the story of the Second World War and how we listened. I talk about George Blackburn and his fabulous books, The Guns of Normandy, but there are others like it. I talk about how veterans took it into their own hands to rectify the lack of memorials overseas to build the Juno Beach Center, unveiled in 2003. I talk about the Canadian War Museum, where I'm very lucky to work. Again, with veterans playing an important role in raising money for that organization. There are other stories here, but I don't want to give away the whole book, and I do hope that you will purchase. But I want to end on some final thoughts. There's a lot that's new in this book. There's a lot that surprised me, and I've spent 25 years studying military history, and I've written 13 books and 12 national exhibitions. I uncovered all kinds of stories. There were stories that brought me to tears. There were stories that made me angry. I know my wife, Sarah, read some early drafts of this, and I was very grateful to her to pull me back and to remind me when I sounded like a lunatic. But there is some anger there. Anger in how we allowed others to diminish the Canadian war effort. And I have a section on what British and American historians wrote about the Canadian Army and the Navy, and often getting it wrong and yet pronouncing with great certainty on the Canadian fighting experience. I was angry about how Canadians, for much of our history, chose to ignore our contributions. I was angry at the CBC and other productions for not creating a major series of films or documentaries of which we could tell our story. I know we can't produce Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers, but as I said before, we haven't even tried. This is a story that is the fight for history. And I've found after 25 years in Ottawa that history can be seen as a dangerous thing. The same way that C.P. Stacy faced political masters who were afraid of history. History can be scary to those in power, but perhaps more damaging, I think, is apathy. Apathy. It's easy in this digital age to be distracted, and I think perhaps that's the defining element of our age, constant distraction. That, and of course, instant outrage. History, however, requires taking the long road. It requires a long view. Outrage is fine, but more often, I think, is the importance of understanding the context and the events within the context and how they are grounded in time and place and individuals. I also found in this book that the fight for history takes champions. It requires small numbers to fight, to expend energy, to work hard, to toil against apathy. The cultivation and creation of history, the desire to keep the flame alive, is often lonely work. And yet there have been significant victories over the last 25 years. But it's work that must continue. And sometimes at these book launches, people read from their books. I don't generally do that, but I do want to read you one paragraph towards the end of the conclusion. And it is this, just give me a second. In talking about history, in talking about the champions, in talking about the need to fight for our history, I write, the work is hard and not always appreciated in broader society, and yet still there are amateur and professional historians doing their bit, researching, writing, and telling stories. Often they uncover acts of heroism and courage that go hand in hand with hurt, loss, and trauma. This eternal search is enriched by partnerships with curators in museums and archivists in the memory houses of the nation. It is done at the national, community, family, and personal level. It involves high school teachers and their students. Journalists, filmmakers, authors, and painters can all tell and reach wide audiences, and they play their role in uncovering the past and in presenting new interpretations. If there is one unifying thread in this ongoing fight, it is that there was no single narrative of the war, and nor should anyone want to reduce it to only one. History is messy, tangled, and complex. It is unsettled and contradictory. It takes effort to understand, and its meaning changes from generation to generation. But we must push back against apathy and indifference. We must tell our stories truthfully and bravely. Your attendance here tonight shows your interest. Thank you. I think it's a fight that matters to many of us as individuals, in our communities, to our country. And there's no winning in this fight, but it's a good fight, an important fight, a necessary fight. We owe it to those Canadians who served in the necessary war more than 75 years ago. We owe it to those who died and who never had a chance to participate and contribute to the modern Canada. We owe it to ourselves to better understand our shared past that so deeply shaped our country and who we are, and how it continues to resonate in the present. And perhaps we owe it to the future, to the young, to those yet not born, who will inherit our complex and contested country and who should know something meaningful about Canada's staggeringly important contribution to the necessary war. Merci. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. It's weird not hearing applause after a talk like this. So I'll do it very briefly. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
So there have been a number of questions already posted throughout Tim's talk this evening. And it actually gives me a lot of anxiety seeing all of these questions come up. So I've been slowly kind of jotting down some of the questions that I would like to ask Tim. We have about 15 minutes, maybe a bit more if Tim wants to keep going for questions. What I will do is I will try to mention the name of the person who wrote the question and then follow it up with the question that they actually asked and then allow Tim to answer it. So the first question to you, Tim, is, of course, I've already lost the name here. All right, I've lost the name, so I will have to, I will just have to go with the question itself. And I think it goes along with this theme that you kind of came back to over and over, Tim, of kind of stories lost and attempts to recover those lost stories. And the first question is, how will the eventual absence of witnesses, as in veterans, of the Second World War influence tomorrow's historians who wish to recount the story of the Second World War?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it worries me. We had 1.1 million Canadians who served. We lost 45,000 killed in the war. But now time and age has claimed far, far more than the enemies in the war. We are down to fewer than 30,000, and I was on a radio show in Halifax earlier this week And there were 3 veterans who were coming out to an event in September, and they were 100 years old, 98 years old, and a youngster at 94. And I reflect upon what will happen when we lose our eyewitnesses to history. We have lost all of our Great War veterans. And I remember being asked in 2010 if that meant the end of history. And I said, I didn't think so, but I'm a historian. I'm more comfortable looking backwards than predicting into the future. But I thought that the legacy in our archives, in our museums, in our families, in our history books, in our films, and in everything, our novels and plays, would allow us to continually imagine and reimagine the Great War experience. And I think the same will occur with the Second World War. But I suppose now would be the time, and I think in the previous 10 or 15 years, to talk to our veterans, those who are left, to hear their stories. I know, and one of the things I talk about in the book are the incredible oral history projects that are across this country that have been going on for at least 20 to 25 years to record those experiences. And they will be crucial going forward into that period when we leave behind the last of our veterans.
Excellent. Thanks, Tim. So the second question I have, and this is from Benjamin Hett. His question, he asks that German commanders' memoirs after the Second World War attempted to sanitize the German history of the Second World War. And he wonders whether the success of the Canadian war effort and its very clear moral position perhaps might explain this lack of impetus to tell the story of Canada's Second World War experience.
Yeah, it's a great question and observation. And I talk about the German memoirs in the book. And for those who don't know, of course, many of the German generals who, once they emerged from their prison sentences, were encouraged to write their histories. They were encouraged often by the American army, which was fascinated by the way that the Germans had fought the Soviets on the Eastern Front, of course, expecting to fight World War III at some point and hoping to glean the lessons. They encouraged the Germans to write their histories, but they were, we know now, and perhaps we knew at the time, sanitized and self-serving. And I think that may be part of the story. I think I'm always cautious about blaming other people. I think that there is an element to this of other nations telling their stories and perhaps overshadowing Canada. But surely it is our job to tell our story. Don't expect the Americans and the British and the French and the Germans to tell the Canadian story. And so I see it really as a failure of Canadian senior commanders. Imagine if we had the senior naval commanders and army commanders and others, Air Force, who all wrote memoirs of their accounts, we would have a much better understanding. There are a number of potted memoirs, 1 or 2 good ones. General Burns, I've always liked his, General Mudd, a few other accounts, but they came very late. Most of them, General Burns, if I remember, is 1970, but others are much later. And so there was an absence there, an absence while other countries were writing about their history, talking about their history, and we failed.
Perfect. Thanks, Tim. So the next question comes from actually a previous colleague of the center. Hello, Trevor Ford, all the way from Vancouver, British Columbia. Trevor's question to you, Tim, was there major parliamentary opposition to Mackenzie King's decision not to build a Second World War monument?
Yeah, and hello, Trevor. Nice to connect, if only this way. Most of the other parties supported the Mackenzie King government. Certainly the CCF did. And with that, Mackenzie King, they didn't need the other parties. And so there was a debate about this. I understand the discussion. And in the book, you'll see a much more, I think, nuanced discussion here. I don't begrudge the people of 1945 or 47 who wanted to build a library or a tennis court for the fallen soldiers, and their justification sometimes made sense, right? We want those who fell in defense of our country And our ideas, we want them to live on, and we want to create places of life and places where people will come to gather and think of a library. The problem, which was also pointed out at the time, is that without the sacred monuments like Vimy or like the National Memorial, without those, there was no place to gather and to bear witness, without using that term. And so I understand the process, but it's an important element in understanding why we don't have a memorial. And maybe I will pose to this group, and I won't be able to hear your response. Is it too late to build a memorial? If you remember, in the United States, I think it's only in 2004 when they built their memorial to the World War II veterans. We may have passed that point. It may not be something that anyone would want to do. It wasn't until the early 1980s when the Second World War veterans gave up on the memorial and agreed to have the dates inscribed on the National Memorial, where they are to this day. And yet, isn't that incredible that there was no National Memorial, even the dates on it, until 1982? That tells us something of the absence.
So continuing on that kind of question of absence, which I think is a really interesting theme that I'm sure will come up over and over again to those who do purchase your book, Tim. So the next question comes from a fellow author, Ted Barris from Oxford. And his question is around this failure to tell the story and this fight for history. Is there a place where we can lay blame for this failure to tell the story? And does that place lie in public institutions like universities and schools, or does it lie elsewhere?
And hello to Ted, who has done, I talk about champions in the book, those who have fought for our history. And Ted is one, and his book, Breaking the Silence, is a tremendous contribution in veterans and talking about their experiences. And Ted, as many will know, has spent, I think, most of his adult life interviewing veterans and has an incredible collection. The assigning of blame, there isn't one group, there isn't one villain. I'm not like Ian Mackay and Jamie Swift and think that there's some cabal of secret people trying to keep down the story. That's nonsense. That's not history. That's make-believe activism. But I do think that there were times in the history when we could have told our story more effectively, and I lay that out in the book. And one of the things is in our universities where there has been a significant diminishment of the way we tell our story, our national history. Jack Granatstein got it right in 1997 or 1998, and Who Killed Canadian History. That too is a complex story, and I don't want to diminish the rise of social history and cultural history. I see myself as a social historian and a cultural historian, and yet the absence of national history or its massive diminishment has also played a role. And how that plays out through those who are taught and then who become teachers over time. But it's not one group. One might look at the NFB and the CBC as I do. One might look at other political decisions not to build monuments or not to do this and that. In the end, it's a cumulative effect. And one of the things I try to lay out in the book is how we got to that point in the early 1990s, when we could create a series like the Valor and the Horror that focused on the defeat and the disgrace and frankly the immorality, as they saw it, of bombing, and how that could be accepted in an award-winning film. And so it's a fairly complex argument I lay out, but I think a defensible one. And more importantly, as I write in the book, I hope that this will not be the last discussion here. It is fairly surprising to me that we don't and haven't had a book like this. This is a significantly new book, pulling together multiple strands of scholarship and memory and commemoration, and influenced by my own history as a public historian and an academic historian and I suppose a popular historian. And I am presenting something. And I do hope that other scholars will come to this and look at it and explore it through a different lens, a regional lens, a linguistic lens, a gender lens, or something else. But I think that this will be a foundation upon which to build. And I know enough about history that there will be people who are quite opposed to what I have written here.
Maybe building off of that, Tim, I wonder, and I've wondered this myself, but this particular question comes from actually a friend of mine, and you've visited one of his military history book club meetings. His name's Russ Eisinger from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And Russ wonders, and I'm very curious about this too, you've now covered basically all your bases in the world wars. You've talked about the military history of the First and the Second World Wars, soldiers' experiences of the First and Second World Wars, and now a book each on the memory of the world wars. And of course, many others. So I guess a number of us are wondering, Tim, what lies next down the road for you? Do you know what topic you want to tackle next?
Yes, and I'm always fascinated by our stories, our collective stories. And this book came out yesterday, but I'm pretty deep into the next one as well. But I'm going to keep that to myself in case it doesn't work out. I started another book that I lost steam on, and it was a very complex book that I wanted to write, and I'll put that aside. So I won't go into all the details. I will say that one of the things I do love is my job at the War Museum. I know many who are on this discussion have visited there, and the power of public history and the ability to reach Canadians and to tell stories, I think, is really important. And we're going through a fascinating period in our own Canadian history now of questioning the past and engaging with the stories that have not been told, and struggling with how we tell more diverse stories while still keeping, I think, our grounding in history. And I think these are really interesting and important areas to explore. I'm not sure I'm the right person for that in a book form, but I certainly am excited about exploring that in the public history environment. But I always have a number of projects on the go, academic articles, popular articles. I'm a director at Canada's History Society, which is a tremendous organization which has made it its goal and mission to share the story of Canada. And some people will know that I have written and published in there. So there's always projects to keep me going. And don't worry, there'll be something else coming down the line, probably in about a year and a half or 2 years.
Okay. Tim, why don't we just do 2 more questions and then we'll wrap things up for tonight. Actually, and building off of the public history angle, there's a woman that I've been following on Twitter quite a while. She's, I believe she did her master's at Western University, is now going to Carleton for her PhD. And she looks at photography, and her question is about photography. And she wonders if you have had any indication of photography playing a role in the development of the memory of the Second World War.
Well, I hope the questioner writes her dissertation on that. We need a study on photography in the Second World War. There are at least 500,000 official photographs taken of the Second World War. It's an astonishing collection. And often we see the same images used time and time again. I think the Library Archives Canada, which has those photographs, has done a really great job recently in digitizing and making them available, as well as the Canadian Army Film Unit, film footage. I think it's the role of the archives to put the material out there. It's the role of the rest of us to do the hard work and to put it together into coherent stories and analysis. And I look forward to a study by someone on photography and the war and its impact. Personally, I haven't seen an impact in that way. If one thinks of Ken Bell, who did a prominent book, I think in the 70s, that was one way to explore it, but it hasn't yet been proven or even explored by many scholars on the impact of what those photographs might be on our collective memory. I would say, however, that visual culture, along with material culture, is an important way to understand the past. And again, putting on my public historian hat, The works of art and film and photographs, these can tell us a tremendous amount about what actually happened. And then the way that they are used and reused over time also tell us important things in the stories we tell. And one of the things I do write about in the book is, what is the most famous photograph of the Second World War for Canada? I would suggest to you it is the cover that is on Cleo's Warriors of the dead Canadians on DiePPE Beach. It has been used time and time again. Isn't it odd that that is our photograph? If you think of other countries and their key iconic material to illustrate their war experience. And I think it's an area that bears much new scholarship, and we will benefit from that.
Mm-hmm. And I think for the last question, Tim, maybe I'll tie a number of questions together, because there does seem to be some...
That's cheating.
And it seems that there is some interest in your views of kind of moving forwards. Now, you've written about the memory of the Second World War as a significant gap that you've now filled. Perhaps you could touch on, and this is from Nick Wheeler in particular, he asks whether or where other gaps exist and what exactly those gaps are in the Second World War literature that we need to fill.
Well, I think, as I write in the book, I would say the Second World War literature is about a generation behind that of the Great War. And the Great War, and the rest of our history is largely untold. If we think of the Great War having turned in sharply to social military history in the 1990s, and in the early 21st century embracing cultural military history and the study of gender and children and others, I think the Second World War still has a long way to go. I would like to hope that my book is a significant way to think about the larger memory of the war, and that scholars then and the gifted public may turn to certain things that they find interesting. For me, I think there are multiple areas, and I won't explore them all, but I do think the veterans' impact on Canada remains one where, while I discuss it in my book, is an important one to continue to explore and to understand. I think the visual iconography of war is always crucial. I think there will be those who explore monuments and memorial and history making. It continues on. I think if we talk about the two world wars, and if one need only look at the Journal of Canadian Military History out of Laurier and the incredible articles in there, we also see in the book review section all kinds of new scholarship into the Cold War period. And I think that's really exciting. Certainly more work needs to be done there. I find it strange, though, that so few scholars explore the 19th century in our country. And certainly 18th century scholarship, too, also seems to just not be an area where people are working very hard. So I think that you could point to a few scholars here and there in the broader field, but there remains much work to be done.
Okay. Well, Tim, first of all, I'd just like to thank you very much for your understanding, your cooperation, and your patience, as this was our first event in the webinar series. And also thank you for a phenomenal and thought-provoking talk, as well as for taking the time to answer questions from many, many of our patrons that have attended tonight.
Thanks, Eric. And thank you to everyone who came and who are still with us. I miss the donuts and I miss the conversations. Part of the best thing about these talks, for me at least, is to meet you and to hear your stories. And there have been so many times when I have spoken to veterans, when I have spoken to the children of veterans and those who have been shaped by war. And that to me is a great pleasure. And that's one of the things that keeps me going and why I put in the long hours and the hard yards. And I hope before too long that we do have a chance to get together wherever you are and to talk history again. Thanks very much.
For sure. Now, I would like to remind everyone that we have agreed with Penguin Random House Canada to provide you with a 20% discount code for Tim Cook's new book, The Fight for History. If you go on to thepenguinshop.ca, search for The Fight for History, add it to your cart, and when you're checking out, make sure to type in Tim Cook 20, TIMCOOK 20 in the discount code bar to receive 20% off of his book. And again, I have included all of that information in the chat function for you. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. You should have my information from all of the different emails you've been receiving from Zoom. Before we wrap up, I would like to thank the Region of Waterloo Museums for partnering with us for this event. They've been a fantastic group to work with, and I look forward to working with them in the future. The last thing I'll say is that if you really enjoyed our event tonight, I would highly encourage you to visit canadianmilitaryhistory.ca, scroll to the bottom of the page and hit subscribe. From there, you will be given information about future talks, just like Tim has given, future webinars, publications in the Canadian Military History Journal, again, as Tim has referred to, and other things that are going on at the Laurier Military Center. Our next event in the webinar series is going to feature David O'Keefe on October 21st at the same time, 7:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And he is going to be discussing his book, 7 Days in Hell, which was published last year. So we certainly hope that all of you are able to make it. Of course, if you're not, we really hope to see you in the future at future events. And otherwise, I hope everyone has a fantastic night. Stay safe, and we will talk very soon.